Okay, we're doing it. We're talking about baby sleep.
Yep.
This episode is all about why and how we sleep trained our kids. We're going to get into some nitty gritty, just kind of thoughts and perspectives about sleep training in our modern society and a way that you can approach it that is balanced.
This is the Balanced Family Podcast with Ben.
And Jessica, there's a lot to balance when you have a family. Marriage, kids, health, career, while you're trying to balance all the opinions out there on how to do things right.
Today, we'll cut through the noise, tackle hard questions, and share stories as we try to get to the heart of the things that really matter. Okay, a disclaimer.
And got to do disclaimers.
We are not baby sleep experts or baby sleep scientists or whatever. No. And that's why in our baby sleep class, is actually predominantly taught by a baby sleep consultant. We teach like one lesson. But I will say that our three kids, all three of them, slept amazingly, relatively.
Yeah.
And still do.
They still do.
And we have no fights at bedtime, and like they just sleep. Like
they just go to sleep.
So I say all that to say, like, the proof's in the pudding. And I'm not saying that our methods are like superior. All this episode really is us talking about why we chose what we chose and the results we got. I've talked to many parents who had completely different approaches who also have really good results. So it's not like if you don't do it our way, your kids aren't going to sleep. But I just preface with that is like, we do know what we're talking about. So I want to ask you though, Jess, why in the world is baby sleep a controversial touch point for people?
I think, number one, I think the main driver of baby sleep in our modern time is the fact that women are working. Mm-hmm. I do think that is what has caused a big shift, because you have kind of what we're experiencing today is kind of a backlash against probably a few decades before this idea that, and you can hear a lot of the older generation say, if you are picking up your baby too much, you're spoiling them. If you let them cry, at all, or if you respond to them at all at night, then you are just creating a bad habit. A lot of that generation, it wasn't uncommon for them to basically at 6 weeks, just kind of shut the door on their baby and not respond until they woke up the next morning. I mean, that was a very so that was like old school, like sleep training. That kind of came out of, I don't even know when it really started, but it would have been probably sometime like in the 80s-ish, 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. And so today you have this it's so controversial because you do have a lot of people who are coming out who are saying like, hey, that is actually not okay to do. It's not good for baby. But you have now this tension because you have moms who are income earners for their homes. They are working. Many of them are working full-time jobs. Some are working part-time jobs. There's a lot more demand on moms. Mm-hmm. But then you also have the reality that we're going to get into, which is like, you do also have to respond to your baby at night. And so you have these moms who are like, I have to sleep. Like I'm dying because I'm so tired. And then then to top it all off, and this really started probably, 15 years ago, you have all these blogs that tell you, if you ever Google any kind of sleep issue, you have all these blogs telling you the right way to make sure your baby sleeps. And they literally all say the same thing. Mm-hmm. Or I'm sorry, they all say different things.
Yeah.
And like all of them, their conclusion is, and if you don't do it this way, you're going to suffer. And so I think that for me, maybe that's kind of a long-winded way of painting the picture, but I think that actually demonstrates how complicated it is, because it's not just as easy to say, I don't know, whatever, like why baby sleep is such a hot topic. But I think that it is one that a lot of people have very strong feelings and opinions on. And a lot of that is dependent on their life context and circumstances, which we'll get into in a minute. But
man, it's super interesting because
it's stressful just talking about it, by the way.
Yeah.
Painting it, I'm like, that's stressful.
Well, I think it's interesting you bringing up maybe some of those generational mindsets, because you could say, well, decades ago, women, weren't working as much. There were more stay-at-home moms, but they, like you said, they opted for more of those harsher sleep training methods because of a psychological fear of spoiling the kid, Wouldn't you agree?
Well, there was a lot of experts that came out around that time. You have Baby Wise, you have Dr. Spock, you have a lot of these expert pediatricians who came out and basically said, like, created, like, it was like the first baby manuals to come out. And they have some that are, I've done research on this because I'm a geek and this is, I enjoy learning about the history of some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So there were like pamphlets that would come out about like, you know, best practices for your baby, starting in probably like the 19th century. But you really didn't, and maybe even a little bit before then, but you started having this kind of systematic manual, you know, Dr. Spock's, you know, I forget what it's called, but it's like the main book that came out, I think it was like in the 50s or 60s, that told parents how to take care of their babies, you know, and so all of it's about formula feeding because that was a predominant way that babies were fed back then. And then you kind of have this then new niche, essentially, that kind of grew of these experts saying, this is the best way to care for your baby. And so there would be these sleep training manuals that would come out that would recommend these certain ways of doing things that very much it wasn't even maybe as much dependent on work, but I think it came out during a time when a lot of women were now working out of the home more and more and more and more. So there was a need. There was a need for it. It resonated with them, like, yes. And so I think it was kind of a collision of time that then created a whole generation. I've had like moms in our birth class, you know, say like my mother-in-law or whoever is constantly telling me that I'm spoiling my baby, you know, or I've even had moms say like, I feel like I'm spoiling my baby. And it's like, no, that's an old school way of thinking that comes from some of those authors and different baby manuals.
And almost just like the overemphasis of methodology.
Yes. And formulas.
And really it's interesting when you study like mass media and just the impact that has on education and like public health. And there's so much good that comes out of that. And societies can become healthier because of like science becoming the word on the street finally. But at the same time,
like smoking is a great example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or, I mean, even taking care of babies, there's so much that science can help, but people can maybe view authority as like this deity of like, this is the right way to parent, when it's like, there's a difference between methodology and theory behind something like taking care of baby sleep or whatever, and actuality in your situation, in your home. And so I think people want a formula. And we talk a lot about that in our brands. Like people just want a formula, but to be balanced, there's just sometimes not this perfect formula.
No.
By the way, I like it when we talk history, and it's like really attractive to me as
talk
a former
history to me. Come on now.
Kind of hot, like as a former history teacher.
Did you learn something today?
I did.
Oh, good.
Well, what we learned personally, and we'll kind of transition into, and we have a couple more things to talk about regarding society, but when we transition to our personal experience, we found quickly that our philosophy of sleep was tied to our values. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by values, I mean like literally the things that are important to you, like being able to have alone time as an adult, as grown-ups, to be able to have an evening without a kid in your arms. Like that was something we valued. And that started to shape our sleep philosophy, knowing full and well the arguments against that. And what we're getting at is the reason sleep is so controversial is it touches that attachment parenting debate, attachment parenting versus like the traditional extreme, you know, more well, I wouldn't say that the mainstream is extreme, but like traditional. And when I say, it's kind of funny to even say traditional, because for eons, attachment parenting would have been the more traditional. But what I'm trying to say is attachment parenting.
Traditional to us.
Yes. Attachment parenting versus very rigid, put your kid in kind of a box kind of parenting. And we always strive to be kind of in the middle.
Here's a better way of putting it. Okay. Child-focused versus parent-focused.
That is a better way to put it.
That's probably the better way to put it, and so there is a place in the middle that we love to live, which is, you know, we're not going to only be child-focused, right?
Yeah.
But we're also not only going to be parent-focused, and our kids just have to like live in our parent world, and we never do anything for their benefit either.
Yeah.
You know, so I think is that helpful?
That is helpful. And I feel like most people are kind of in the middle. Like nobody, there are and I think a growing number of parents that the attachment movement really resonates.
Well, and they are actually just very child focused in general.
That's what I'm saying. Like our society is so individualistic, so child focused, so obsessed with like just your kid not being traumatized or just your kid being so healthy and perfect.
Happy
is a big one. That is growing. But I think in actuality, a lot of people end up kind of being in the middle because they just want to be practical. But I think people come to the middle not always like intentionally. And therefore, sometimes you may not have a good philosophy and system around how you build a sleep culture in your home. We tried to be really intentional about that. And I think that's why we had so much success it was like, we are going, and we talked about this last week, we're going to have this set time of the day, even when our kids are older, where it's like, this is rest time. And we created an environment around that. If you're super child focused, how do you do that when you have three kids in the house? That's what I'm saying.
So the philosophy is, this is not, I mean, I literally see Instagram posts about this. This is not the time for me. This is not the time for my marriage. This is not the time for this to be at all about us, because we only have 18 summers with our kids, and we only you can maybe hear in my tone, like I don't agree with that, because I think that again is setting your kids up actually for a really warped view of the way their world works, because if they are used to everything revolving around them, they're going to graduate at 18 and have a really hard time in the workplace or college or in relationships. And this again is into the values, this stuff.
You can keep talking. I want to say something though that kind of counters that, but you can keep talking.
Well, no, I'm done. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, cool. I think you oversimplified that though, because there's research even that shows that there is developmentally a time where attachment is not going to quote unquote spoil your child, excuse me. And that you can, and this is what the attachment parenting, the child focused people say, is that you're not spoiling a baby and a toddler. Like they actually it can lead to more self-confidence and stuff like that. The problem, and by the way, I think there's validity to that. But the problem is that a lot of parents, they stay in that ultra child focused type of home, type of perspective, so that when those kids are teenagers, they are still child focused. And so even if they say you're not going to spoil them or something like that, it's interesting to see a lot of parents can't really get out of that mindset. And that's where I would agree that yes, eventually that can bite you in the rear.
And that's actually when I was saying that, I was thinking of kids in school age and above.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with you. Like, I think that there is a time in a season of your life where just out of necessity, like your life is mostly caring for your kids. Mm-hmm. I think it's more about actually like a value, like in a place that, and a perspective that parents have that I think then leads to just a lot of, just self-focus and just there's no boundaries. And a lot of it then kind of comes, oftentimes it's hand in hand with the gentle parenting stuff, which we talked about in a past episode, and how, parents are too afraid to have authority in their kids' lives. So really, like, this is such a big issue, and we should probably just stick to just talking about baby sleep, because we could go on on and on about, like, it really is like a philosophical issue that I hope, like, maybe what you're hearing from us is saying that baby sleep is connected to your worldview, the way that you intend to build your family. And you do have to be intentional with that. And you do have to be thoughtful about like what is, and like, I'm going to get into some more of like kind of how we thought through it. Can I do that? Or do you want to talk about something else?
I had a couple more big picture things before we kind of shift into some practicality.
Go for it. Go big picture.
And it's something you just said about the philosophical viewpoints. Yeah, I find it really interesting that in more of that industrial type mindset, maybe a few decades ago, there's a fear of spoiling your child. And there was a big emphasis on like achievement. Like that's kind of the environment we grew up in the 90s. It's like achievement. It's like, you're the next president, you're the next Michael Jordan. If you work hard, like
If you work hard, you can achieve
I mean,
anything.
it was the 90s, man. Like
Literally,
the
I had a
Cold War
folder
was,
that said that.
Yeah, the Cold War was over. It was just like we felt like on top of the world. It's just like go achieve. Now there's almost like the opposite fear where instead of parents being like, man, I don't want to spoil my child and they not become like a high achiever. Now there's like the opposite where it's like, man, I don't want to, neglect my child and
I
they
don't want to put too much
damaged
pressure on my kid.
and they be traumatized and they
Right.
can't find themselves and how, all this stuff.
They're going to have so much, they're not going to be happy.
But it's there. You still see that same pressure and this kind of irrational viewpoint that you're going to like screw up your kid when it's like, if your kid has a roof over their head and food
And love
and nurturing, which most parents are, it's like, you're not going to screw up your kid with your sleep philosophy. But you see that kind of anxiety over multiple generations.
Yeah.
And then one last thing I want to say about attachment parenting that I do I hear that crowd and I want to say, I agree that throughout most of human history, parenting probably was more on the attachment spectrum because of just more like less industrialized societies. And I just think that that's common sense. However, as a historian, it's always a pet peeve of mine when people oversimplify things.
Overgeneralize.
And you get mad at like the diets that people are like, this is how humans were supposed to eat originally. And it's just like when people
also their lifespan was 35.
When people over glorify like primitive societies kind of annoys me because then it goes back to, again, just like there's a right and wrong way. And it's just like there's probably a lot of those parents that are like, man, I wish we could get on a schedule. And who knows, maybe they did have, in especially agrarian societies, a way of structuring nap time. You don't know that. Like you weren't alive 2,000 years ago. So anyway, it's always a pet peeve when people
also
women like, this is the most original way to do things.
Women were very busy during the day and they were definitely not entertaining their kids 24/7. In fact, they were probably not watching their kids at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just saying.
Go smoke on that.
Like
for a little while.
They were in the fields and their kids were around them.
Yeah.
And would get snake bitten. And I mean like that actually was what life was. Or you were really rich and you had someone else take care of your kids for you.
Yeah.
Which also was very common for the wealthier crowd. They had governesses and nannies and anyway.
That makes me think
we get annoyed with just the overgeneralization that we see. That's just like, I mean, because I think what that does is it creates guilt. It creates guilt and stress inside of our really complex modern world because we feel like that we're not being, to this ideal standard that never even actually existed to begin with. And like parents are all just trying to do our best, and they have been trying to do their best since the beginning of time in really difficult situations. And our life is no different. We have challenges now that were not in existence 100 years ago. They had challenges then that we don't have to deal with. So it's like, you can't just sit here. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but it's just like instead of looking out and comparing and getting all the clickbait social media posts that make you feel like you're not doing things right and going down all the rabbit trails of all the different, attachment parenting, just all that stuff. It's like, okay, no, silence the noise and ask yourself, what does our family need?
Yeah, exactly.
What do we need? Which segues, I think, into what we want to talk about, which is how we made the decision about sleep and baby sleep.
And I would say one of those primary, moving into the practicality of why we chose that, we chose the sleep train because we valued you and I time. And I would say that was actually good for our kids. Because the attachment argument is like, well, that's just really selfish. You want to sit around and watch Netflix. It's like, that's not really was our philosophy. For us to be able to have...
We also didn't co-sleep. That's important to add into here as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very typical. I actually just saw a reel before we did this of a lady who's a really big co-sleep advocate. And she was responding to a question about how her and her husband have intimate time. And she was just basically like, you just do it. And it was a very interesting perspective. And I have nothing against co-sleeping. like whatever. But for us, like that would be another example of something that we didn't do again because we wanted that.
Didn't we co-sleep maybe when they were newborns?
Yeah,
briefly.
To me, that doesn't even really.
That doesn't count,
I'm talking like they're school age and they're co-sleeping.
I've known
like
people that co-slept until their kids were 11.
Right, mega beds. That level of co-sleeping where you're like sleeping together. And yes, like people in history have absolutely done that.
Yeah. And we're not judging.
And I have no judgment against that. This was just a decision for us that we felt like was right.
And we just are living proof like you can have some structure to your life and your kids don't come out damaged. On that whole thing about you and I time, I feel like we were our best version of ourselves for our kids because we had some kind of routine to be able to like
take a breath,
mentally exhale.
Yeah.
And I could not have imagined like not doing it like that. Honestly, I just felt like we were our best version of ourselves because we did that. And we were nurturing, we were responsive to their needs in so many other ways and so many parts of the day. We just had a goal and we built our family around that.
I want to also say too, the other reason why we sleep trained was a lot of what we felt like was kind of like the call on our life, if you want to say that. So we both worked.
Yeah.
And I worked for a good amount of my early motherhood, especially. And then I took a little bit of time off, as a stay-at-home mom, but now, I currently work. We are leaders inside of our church. So we do a lot of extracurricular stuff with that. We have a very robust social life. Like there was just a lot that we had going on that again, it was like we wanted to be able to give inside of those areas as well.
Yeah.
And so I remember, part of our, the way that we approached baby sleep, one of the things that we really cared a lot about was having our kids be portable in sleep.
Yeah.
So we wanted to be able to go over to someone's house and meet with them and literally stick a pack and play anywhere in their house and put our baby or kids down for sleep for the night in their house. And we did it. Like we absolutely had that ability. And again, that was intentional due to what we knew was kind of like the requirement on our life to be able to have that flexibility at times.
If you don't have kids in that stage yet, they probably don't understand why that's a big deal, but I would just briefly tell them, if you're extremely responsive to your kids 24/7, very child focused, when you go into a new environment, like a friend's house, like a relative's house, they do not want to go down for a nap. And
unless you have, like there's some babies that I know will do it,
because
but
they're scared.
Yeah.
It's a new environment. And so you actually have to be intentional with how you teach your kids that they are safe and that you are in the other room and that this is an okay place to take a nap. And it seems so simple, but that's a very hard thing for people. So what happens a lot of times that we saw if people were more child focused is that, you just can't have.
They were stuck at home.
They were stuck at home, or they would come over and their kids on them and you're not having a real conversation and their kids screaming because they're overtired. Because that's the thing is if
you take your kids with you because you're like, oh, well, they can just be up, and then they're crazy. And you're like, oh my gosh.
Because they're overtired. Yeah. And that brings me to my next point. Like I would say we just valued our kids getting consistent sleep, regardless of what the method was. But we liked being responsive to their cues. And I felt like we did that. We never forced them to sleep at a time they weren't tired. It's like we paid attention to cues, and there was some scheduling to it, but like our kids slept when they needed to.
Right. Well, and I would say there was a shift. So I would say that like stage 1 is like the first year of their life, which typically it's difficult sometimes to fully schedule because they're going to be having developmental leaps. They're going to be all over the map. They're going to have 3 naps, and they're going to have 2 naps, and they're going to eventually go down to 1 nap. And so you're kind of just dealing with this like kind of constantly moving target that I know is why so many people get so stressed out, is because they'll feel like, okay, finally we've figured it out. Like our baby's sleeping. And then there's a regression. Yeah. Then they have a growth spurt. Then they whatever. And it's just like, it's maddening. And so we're actually not talking about that time period. We're talking more about when they got older and they actually had a set bedtime every night that we like consistently put them to bed unless we had church or something random happen. Yeah. They would go to bed at that time. They had a set nap time. Once they got down to 1 nap, it was like every day. So like we were responsive when they were little, but then there came a point when it was like, no, actually Like you take a nap at noon every day and you sleep we would let them kind of sleep however long. Sometimes it would be short, sometimes it would be long. But so we had like a structure that would almost be like then phase 2 of baby sleep. Does that make, you know what I'm saying? I just want to clarify that because I think sometimes that could make a parent of a 1-year-old feel really stressed because it's hard to actually have that consistency in that schedule. And we were very highly responsive to our kids' needs when they were little. Mm-hmm. But then as it was developmentally appropriate, then we would become a lot more structured.
So that's a good point. So there's different phases and there's different kids too. And some kids honestly are just easier.
Yeah.
Like some kids honestly just like sleeping.
They just sleep.
And they respond to you and then others you have to work with that and get them to understand that it's nap time. And even just like feeling out when to implement some of those strategies. Like for instance, I remember with our firstborn, we had tried some sleep training.
Can we define what we mean by sleep training?
Yeah, go for it.
I think that might be helpful.
Yeah.
Because I think people have all kinds of different views on what sleep training is. So for us, sleep training is literally training our kid to sleep. So that like can look like a lot of different things. It could look like, I think one of the main things is not being too quick to respond.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying we let them cry for like ever, but there's a difference between I am crying because I'm hurt, hungry, pooped my diaper, etc., and crying that's like, oh, I'm kind of sort of waking up, but I'm actually still really tired. Don't come in. It's essentially what that cry is saying is like, I'm kind of waking up, but I'm actually still really cranky. And that's the cry. You learn how to like distinguish between the two. And that's the cry that I would wait on. I would listen. It wasn't like I was just like, good luck. I would listen. And, if that cry turned into the second cry, which is like that I need something cry, I would go in, of course. And I would help get them back to bed.
That's key is that it's not, I'm going to rescue you. It's that I'm here. I love you. I'm going to nurture you. But now let's get you back in the mood to sleep.
Let's go back to bed. But the first cry, actually, I would let them, it's hard to even call it crying. It's like fussing. I would let them fuss a little bit. I would have like kind of in my mind, the time was different for every kid. It was longer, shorter, depending on honestly the kid and what I knew about them. I would wait, I would listen. And like 9 times out of 10, they would just go back to bed. And I knew by experience, because I had gone in before during those fussy times, that like they were not happy to see me. They were like, why are you interrupting my sleep? But a lot of first timers don't know that. They're like, oh my gosh, they're awake. I better go in because they're crying. No. And it's like, no, actually just wait. Let them learn how to put themselves back to bed.
Yeah.
And then if after a while they don't go back to sleep. So like, this is literally what I mean by sleep training. So this isn't like this horrible, like, you're never going to respond to your kids' needs. It's about learning your individual kids' needs and what they like need to sleep, and then help literally training them on how to sleep. By themselves without you.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think some grown adults don't know how to sleep train themselves. Like and I'm being funny, but like you read all the news articles about sleep. It's like the things that they tell adults to do, like. That's what you do for kids. It's like you have some consistency. You get off screens. You wind down. You darken
take a warm bath.
You take a warm bath. It's like, are you having trouble sleeping? And that list is all the things you do with a baby. It's like you create the environment. It gets quieter. You might have soothing music. You read a story. You dim the lights. You know what I'm saying? It's like really common sense. But
it's funny because I read myself a bedtime story every night, basically.
Yeah, but if you go like, if babies can talk and you pulled them and you said, hey, do you want to end all the excitement of your human experience right now and go to sleep? And they're going to say no. And it's just like adults. Like nobody wants to make that sacrifice and have a good bedtime routine. We want to be scrolling TikTok and distracting ourselves and watching Netflix. But it's like, do you want to sleep? This is what you should do.
Right.
And so it's actually pretty common sense. Like sleep training is not about just crying it out. It's about the environment. It's about routine. It's about
knowing your baby's sleepy cues, etc.
And now on the crying, because that's the most controversial part of it. One thing we did learn is like with our firstborn, when we tried, and I'll qualify to say, a lot of people might agree with you, like listening to the fussiness in the middle of the nap. But what about when you're putting them down right there at the beginning? Because that's when you get the most resistance.
But I would say that still to me is fussy.
Exactly. Well, But I would say also
because they're just like, I'm so tired. I can't.
And that's why timing is important. But I remember our firstborn, we probably tried that a little too early.
Yeah.
I remember like it wasn't working. And then we're like,
we need to ditch this.
We didn't like listen to her cry. And so we ditched it. And I mean, maybe just like a few weeks later, we like tried it again.
It might have been a month or two, but yeah.
Maybe a couple months. We tried it again, boom. And it was like, she might have cried for a minute and it was
1
like,
minute. Yeah. It was very
And so
quick.
when people have this idea of cried out, that you're letting them cry for an hour, it's like, it's not like that.
And then she became a much happier baby after that because she actually was sleeping.
It is an art. And I think that's why our class, we designed it and chose the instructor we have, because she really captures the art of baby sleep. It really is an art, and every kid's different.
It's not a science,
and they're different from month to month, but the principles are the same, and just being balanced and creating routines.
Yeah. So I would say if I were to like practically, like some principles that we use with every kid, actually practically, and I usually don't recommend sleep training before 4 months, like even attempting, because there's a lot going on in those first 4 months. And especially if you're breastfeeding, it's just, you actually do need to be waking up in the middle of the night and feeding your baby. Now, that's not to say if your baby starts sleeping through the night on their own before 4 months, love that. You don't need to wake them up to nurse, because then what that means is that they are getting adequate calories during the day, and they just they're not waking up because they're not hungry. But especially before 4 months, like if your baby is waking up at night, that means that they are hungry and you should feed them. And a lot of times my perspective was, okay, like I would go down the checklist in my mind, like, are they hungry? Are they wet? Do they, are they sick? If my babies were sick, that was not a time for me to just like not respond to them. Like, so if I knew they were sick, like I would get up, every time they woke up, even if it was every hour, I would try really hard, not to like play with them, but like to help them in whatever way they needed. So there was kind of like a checklist in my mind that I would go down the list. Like if they wake up an hour after I put them down for a nap, and I know that they had just pooped, let's say, and peed before I had just changed their diaper before the nap, they wake up an hour into the nap. And I'm going down my list then, right? I'm like, okay, well, I know their diaper's probably fine. That's probably not an issue. They probably aren't hungry. Like I know they just ate a ton. Then, maybe I would do more of what I was describing before, that fussy, like listening for the fuss. But in general, still, even before 4 months, like I really wouldn't do a whole lot. I just kind of went with the flow with it. Let them nap in the carriers, etc. But usually around 4 months was when things kind of started shifting. And then also by 4 months, they usually are starting to actually make their own routine. Mm-hmm. So you'll start noticing patterns in their sleep. They may actually want their first nap at like 8 a.m. because maybe they're an early riser. And you're kind of then tracking that as a parent. And you're saying, okay, like when are their usual wake ups? When are they wanting to usually go down for a nap? When are they showing those sleepy cues, which is really important. We talk about that a lot in the class, like how to recognize when your baby's tired and to try to put them to bed, start the bedtime process when they're showing those early sleepy cue signs, not when they're yawning and crying. That's not the time to then all of a sudden start the whole routine. You want to try to catch them a little soon. And I was always so surprised at how quickly my babies were ready to go down for a nap again. It was always wild to me. It felt like all I was doing really was waking them up, feeding them, and then like 10 minutes of hangout time. And then they were ready to go back to bed because it had been, an hour and a half or something. So anyway, all that to say, you start watching for their routine, and then you kind of start building off that routine. Mm-hmm. And so then you're starting to watch the clock a little bit more. You're starting to say, okay, this is usually the time when they're tired. Let's start kind of building in more of a routine, a flexible routine and a flow. And I would just I basically had two separate routines. I had a nap time routine and a bedtime routine. Nap time routine was like an abbreviated version of bedtime where I would, maybe read them a book. I would nurse. I would change their diaper. Dark room, darkness is really important for naps. So I would make sure I had really good blackout curtains and all of that. And then I would often rock them down. So that's what I'm saying. Like some people, there's all kinds of different methods of sleep training. I really was quite responsive. So I'd rock them to where they were almost asleep. Yeah. Not quite asleep, but almost asleep. And I would do this like really funny thing where I'd be rocking them in the chair and then I would stand up and I would rock. And then I would like almost like a pendulum, like let it kind of slow, slow, slow. And then I would stop and I would look at them and I'm like, okay, they're still good. Then I would like carefully put them in the crib, and I'm really short. So I had to like lift them up, and it was a very intense core workout. And you put them down. And then I would like put my hand on their, belly. Yeah. And I would, or back if they were old enough to sleep on their belly, and I would leave it there. And then I would kind of jostle if they started waking, so I had like this whole thing, and then I would leave.
Yeah.
And if they started fussing again, cause sometimes they would start fussing, I would wait. And then if they like kept fussing, then I would go back in, I'd put a passy in or whatever, kind of pat their butt, and then go back out.
Yeah.
And then go back in and do this. And eventually they just learn.
Yeah.
And then night times, it was basically the same thing. And sometimes, we would let them fuss a little bit longer than others. I mean, really, it was just such an art. And I think that's the key, is that sleep training doesn't have to be rigid, and it can be responsive, and it can be gentle.
Yeah.
But I will quote Andrea, who's our instructor for the baby sleep class. Some crying is always going to be involved.
Every time.
It's just whether or not you
not every time, but maybe when you're starting out.
Yeah. I mean, whether you do a more gentle sleep training method, like the whole no cry sleep training method, like, I don't even know.
Dream on.
Like, okay. There's going to be some crying involved, and it's a question of how long you are cool with doing that. So the more gentle methods are going to take a lot longer to work.
Yep.
They're going to involve less crying, like if you were to look at it day to day, but actually kind of involve more crying if you look at it over time.
Exactly.
Whereas the more, quote, like less gentle, I don't want to say like harsh, because they're actually not harsh, but like the more intensive ways of sleep training might have more crying on the onset, but actually result in a whole lot less crying in a lot shorter of time. So anyway, and we talk all about that in the baby sleep class. I'll just shamelessly plug that, because it is a great resource.
Well, really what you're doing is you're teaching your baby how to self-soothe and understand that they can go to sleep by themselves.
Right.
Because basically the baby wants two things. They want to sleep because they're tired, but they want you.
Mm-hmm.
Of course they want you. But that's life, right? None of us want to go to bed. We want to keep binge watching Netflix. But you've got to train yourself as an adult to do what's right. You're helping a child do that. You're teaching them,
right.
I'm going to be here when you wake up. Right now, I'm going to help you teach yourself how to go to sleep.
And as you build that foundation, then, because people also think like, okay, once you sleep train, then they're always sleep trained. No. Because your kids will still wake up. Right. When they're toddlers, they're still going to wake up and they're going to want water, air quotes, water. It's like,
classic.
Bull. You don't want water. You just want to come hang out. And so again, it's this idea of you're building this foundation that helps them understand that there's boundaries and limits in their life that are there to keep them safe and healthy. And we're going to follow those boundaries and limits. And when you start that, when they're little.
Well, and it's teaching that you're an authority. Parents that are so scared of being an authority, they have a lot of problems with sleep when they're toddlers and they get older. And it was interesting. I was talking to a dad once, and one morning he was really tired. He's like, "Yeah, my toddler just kept coming in, and we just eventually gave in and let him just stay up with us and all that kind of stuff." And it was like, I'm thinking, oh, that's hard. And then next morning, same thing. And basically I learned that was like their norm, and they just had no backbone to have boundaries around that kid or any consequences. And then another day we started talking about screen time, because I think one of our kids was similar ages, and he was like, I was talking about how my toddlers like don't get a bunch of iPad time and stuff. And he was like, yeah, well, we already lost that fight. Yeah. My 3-year-old's on his iPad all day. And it's like, I'm noticing a trend. You can't get your toddler to sleep, and you can't get your toddler off the iPad. So you blaming the toddler and you're complaining about your situation. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're talking about in the beginning of this episode. If you're too child focused, it's like, when does it end, dude? When do you just be the boss of the home? And so, you're not being this harsh authority to your baby by just determining a routine around sleep. You're actually helping them, and you're helping your toddler when he's older and he needs to be in bed and he needs to be asleep. And you're helping your toddler know that he doesn't get free reign with the iPad whenever he wants. It's all about how
it's
you
a snowball effect for sure. And it is actually like, I think that's what we're trying to say in the beginning, is that this actually is a foundational philosophy for parenting in general, that the baby, I think that's why baby sleep is so contentious, is because it actually hits at this philosophical foundation of how you even approach parenting.
Yeah.
And everyone has lots of opinions on that. And, you know, I think the balanced way of looking at it is, of course, be responsive to your kids.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, don't just shut the door and never respond. Like, that's insane. But also, like, don't have a child-centered home either. There is this middle ground that looks different for every family. It really does. The outworking of it, you know, whether or not both parents work or don't. I mean, there's so many, you know, whether or not you had leadership stuff like Ben and I did or not, like all of that is going to contribute to like the like architecture of how you build this in your home. And but you have to be intentional. You have to sit down and actually think through, like, what do we want our lives to look like? Like, what is the call on our family's life? How do we want to serve our community? Do we feel called to do that? What will need to happen for us to be able to do that, etc. And then you can build then from there and figure out how you need to approach something like baby sleep, because it will massively affect that, whether you like it or not. Like, if you can't get your kid to sleep and you basically are a prisoner in your own home for 5 years, like that's going to affect your life, you know, and your social life and your all the things.
Another thing that I tell young parents to ask themselves, are you nurturing your child when they're awake? Are you being there for them when they're awake?
Yeah.
Then don't stress about it, the
supposed to be
fear
sleeping.
that you're not nurturing them when they're sleepy.
Right.
It's like, don't be afraid to hear some crying. Like, that is normal. It is, like you said, it has to do with kind of how much you're willing to listen to. But I remember some of ours, it was like the crying did not last long if we stuck with it.
A minute.
And
maybe
you know
two.
what's funny too? Last week we talked about how we had like quiet time in our home, even when our kids got older. Not all of them were napping as hard. I remember our youngest, she probably dropped naps quicker than any of them.
She dropped naps at 2.
Yeah.
2.5.
Yeah. And I remember us being like, what are we going to do?
It was
but we
really
still had a quiet time. Nobody would sleep, but everybody had an hour in their room. They would read books. They would lay in bed. Everybody, it was just like, it was so great and peaceful and helped us reset, because we had a high energy. Well, we still have a high energy home.
We do.
So don't feel guilty that you want to have some routine. Like, that is just insane. If you find yourself afraid that you're going to damage your kid, like, that is insane. That don't listen to voices that are so radical. Like, there's just no research to show that. Now, if you're absolutely abandoning your kid, you know, all
you're
day,
rigid and you're like, I don't care
like
that you are scared of the dark. You know, who cares?
If
Get
you're
in
like,
your bed.
you're like abandoning your kid and doing meth all day, and like,
I don't think people like that are listening to
that's
this
what I'm
podcast.
saying. But that's how some parents feel, as if they like let their baby cry for a few minutes that they're a meth dealer.
And this is a whole other podcast episode. We need to write this one down, talking about the epidemic. And I use that word, the epidemic of parents feeling like they are the sole entertainers of their kids all day long. That also is like a really big thing that I really would love to talk about. Because not only do our kids sleep well, but they also play independently very well. And that was very intentional on my part. Yeah. And I have a whole philosophy about this.
Yep.
For maybe another episode.
That'd be a great one.
Yeah, we should write that down.
Are you your kid's entertainer?
Yeah.
Stop it.
Stop it.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening.
That was kind of meandering, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah.
And and if you have a baby, definitely recommend our baby sleep class if you're interested. It's very, very middle of the road.
Balanced.
So very balanced. Oh yeah. And you can use code podcast
Save 15%.
to get 15% off of it. So, all righty. See y'all
week.
next time. Bye. Thank you so much for listening today. It would mean so much to us if you left a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you heard this.
And let us know your thoughts on today's episode by leaving a comment on Spotify or YouTube, where you can also watch these episodes.